All right. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to what is the last of the Leading Voices in Public Health lecture series for 2010-2011. It's been quite a year, and I think we're ending on a really remarkable note. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Greg Diette, is someone who is quite impressive on paper. Greg holds a faculty position in the College of Medicine in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. He also holds faculty positions in the College of Public Health there in both the Department of Epidemiology and Environmental Health Sciences, and he's the Director of Clinical Research for the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine. That's reasonably impressive, Greg. I'll give you that.
Thank you.
But in practice, Greg is one of these people that is actually more impressive in person than even on paper. He is truly a world expert at pulmonary diseases and asthma. And I can tell you, this is a true story. I met Greg at a conference in India. Greg had been invited to India to talk about pulmonary disease in India. That's when you know you're a world-class expert, when you get invited to other countries to talk about diseases in that country. Now, as we were in India, we enjoyed about 8 hours of a life-threatening experience driving from Chandigarh to Agra and back. And as I always do, I talk to him about possible collaborations. You know, I always talk to people about collaborating, and everyone always says what a great idea it is, and almost no one ever follows up. But to Greg's credit, he has followed up. He's been in touch with us frequently. He's working with one of our faculty members in environmental health to really take the expertise and the research that he's done at Johns Hopkins and bring it down to Appalachia, because as most of you know, asthma and allergies are among the worst here in Tennessee for reasons that we don't fully understand. Greg has been doing research to really understand the full impact of environment, behavior, diet, indoor air, a whole bunch of factors as it affects asthma. So please join me in welcoming a good friend and a real expert, Greg Diette. And I do want to say that Greg is here as a Pfizer visiting professor in pulmonary and critical care medicine, and our thanks to the Pfizer Foundation for making that possible.
Great. Thanks, Randy. Thanks very much, Randy. I'll tell you, actually, though, you know, Randy says it was a good thing that I got invited to India to give a talk about respiratory disease in India. I knew nothing about it. Randy got invited to talk about stuff he already knows about. So it just gives you an idea, like hierarchy-wise, you know, Randy was invited because of who he is. That was a great meeting. I can tell you for you guys in the back, too, I spent my entire college career in the rear left, very last corner, and also med school. It worked just fine for me. You are welcome to migrate up if you want to during this, though. There are some slides. Some of them are awful, so don't worry about those. But a couple of them are actually kind of cool to see, and if you're closer, you'll get some sense of it. The thing I'm going to talk about is asthma today. And does everybody either have asthma or know somebody with asthma, or anybody have an experience with either a family member or a friend, or they take care of people with asthma if you're a clinician? I think it's a condition that we see more and more of. It's really a remarkable epidemic that's going on, and I'm going to try to tell you about some of the stuff that we've been doing about housing. There'll be a little information about mice, which is relatively new stuff, and then it was Randy's idea to put in the hamburger here, but I want to talk about food a little bit and what that might have to do with the story. I'm going to start with a boy that I met about 2 years ago, and he's one of our research subjects. I also am a clinician. I take care of asthmatics, but not kids this young. But we study kids this age, and he lives in East Baltimore, which is where Johns Hopkins Hospital is, and that's our laboratory there. He comes from a low household income, somewhere in the 5,000 to 10,000 range, and he's a fairly symptomatic kid. He has, out of the last 2 weeks, he had symptoms on 4 of the days. He'd woken up two nights out of the last couple of weeks. He'd had 4 trips to the doctor in the last 3 months for unscheduled urgent visits. And if you don't know these medicines, he was on a whole host of medicines that are very powerful to try to keep him under control. And despite the fact that he's on these medicines, he actually still was quite symptomatic in a lot of doctor visits. And one of the things that was true also is he's from a home that has an active smoker in it. He also notes that there are mice and cockroaches in the house. And I want to think about him and think about how it is that he might be so affected by asthma and what we have to understand about him. So I mentioned that there's an epidemic of asthma, and for those of you who are in the back, you can't see the bottom, but this starts in 1980 and goes up to 2006. And the reason it starts in 1980 is it's when the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, started administering a survey nationwide. And so it started in 1980, and they administer it every year. There's a break in the curves because right in the middle of the epidemic, they had the wisdom to change the questions, you know. Unbelievable. But so in 1998, we'll never know for sure whether that one curve would have continued, but they split the questions into two. But I think you can still see that the trend is upwards. And these are just numbers, but if you look at the purplish one, that's children. It was under 4% in 1980 of kids that had asthma. You know, now, depending upon whether it's current or lifetime, it's either about 14% or about 10% with current. That's a remarkable change. That's a 2.5-fold change in only a couple of decades. That's an epidemic. I mean, that's something that's going on that's very, very powerful. The boy that I was talking about was born in 1998, and you'll see I make a couple of marks on some of these slides for different dates because I think they matter in terms of trying to understand this epidemic. But he was born actually the same year they changed the questions, just a coincidence, but he's born in the midst of this epidemic. So one of the things we know is that asthma isn't distributed the same around the country or around the world, and different groups get it more than others. In the US, this is data for children, and it's about 10% overall. You can see the far left is non-Hispanic blacks, and it's about 14%. Whites, it's about 9%. So there's about 50% more asthma in blacks than whites. Hispanics, depending upon where they come from, whether it's Puerto Rico, there's an awful lot of asthma in Puerto Rican immigrants, and Mexicans, not so much. Asians, it's very low. But it's not distributed the same, and it becomes one of the fascinating things about studying asthma, which is to, I think, take advantage of some of the unfortunate disparities that we see and try to learn what it is about one group that might make them have more asthma than another group. So one other thing that's true, this is the last slide like this. This is from the CDC, their data. And ICD-9 is a code for billing and looking at billing codes for asthma. And then also it's used for death certificates. And so looking at death certificate data, you can see that there's a trend that starts in 1980 and goes up to the year 2004. There's a trend upwards that then reverses a little bit for mortality. But the curve that's in red is for blacks. The curve that's in green is for whites. And one of the things you can see is that there's a difference between the curves, and there's a difference here. It's quite sizable. It's about the rate is 10 per million and about 25 per million there. But if you look, even though there's a favorable trend in mortality, the gap is actually wider currently than it was even in 1980. So there's something going on that certainly isn't right if you consider race as a factor to study in asthma. So one of the things I'm going to do is take you through some of the work that we've done in what we call our Center for Childhood Asthma in the Urban Environment. And we've had this center funded by the National Institutes of Health, NIEHS, the Environmental Health Sciences Branch, and EPA. And one of the things I just want to show you is this isn't brand new. In 1998 is when we started this. A colleague of mine who's since retired, Peyton Eggleston, was the first director of it. And we've gone through a variety of iterations. And I don't expect you to read the small print here, but I just want to show you we've had a series of programs. And all of our programs are multifactorial studies where we do observational studies, we do clinical trials, we have laboratory work, all of it focused on this issue of asthma and why is there so much in certain groups of people. This is our conceptual model that we started with, and it still hasn't changed that much in the sense that we're very interested in the effect of allergens and pollutants and how those allergens and pollutants either singly or together combine to make asthma come out in people and how they combine to make asthma worse. And the thing at the bottom here says is that we do this not in a vacuum but in the real world, the real context, which is that there's real factors like poverty, stress, education, adherence to care, access to care. All these other things are part of the milieu or the soup, if you will, of the way that people live with asthma, and we try to study all of this at once. So this is my laboratory. This is a view of East Baltimore. If you haven't been there, this is off the back of the parking garage where I park, and some of our study subjects live right there and very close. And this is typical Baltimore City, which is its turn of the last century housing. You know, around 1900, it's brick row homes, 2 and 3 stories, tucked together. Some of them abandoned, some of them not. You'll see a church in the upper left, a very important part of the community too. Lots of churches and lots of old homes. So I want to address 3 questions first that we tackled, and then take you in another direction towards the hamburger business. But part of it, because this is 3 of the things that we worked on, not the only things, but I think they illustrate 3 different things. One is There's been a question for years about whether or not if you're going to develop asthma, is it just because you live in a different home? People have wondered, is there an asthmagenic home, and is it just that there's a preponderance of some particular factor in that home? If there were, if you eliminated it, you might not get asthma. A separate one is, because this is relatively new, is whether or not mouse allergen can contribute to asthma. And I'll explain what these are, but PM is particulate matter and NO2 is a gas. I'll explain more about what those are. But do pollutants in the house, airborne pollutants, do they aggravate asthma? So this first question about the systematic differences in the homes, I'll just show you the way the study went here is we studied on preschool-age children, so kids who were age 2 to 6 at the time. They had to be in East Baltimore. We worked with a community advisory group, and we came up with 9 contiguous zip codes to define what East Baltimore was. And if they had asthma, they'd had a healthcare encounter in the past 12 months. The caregiver told us that their doctor had diagnosed them with asthma. They had to have current symptoms or medication use. And we compared them to controls who were kids who also had a doctor in the same East Baltimore area who said that they didn't have asthma. And we had some ways to confirm that they didn't have asthma. So this is a map of Baltimore City, and a couple things to show. So that it goes up and over like that. So this is sort of the northeast quadrant, if you will, of Baltimore City. The northern edge is up at the top. You can't see the southern edge. It's off the map. The Inner Harbor is right down there where it says 895. If you've ever heard of the Inner Harbor, it's one of the tourist attractions in Baltimore. A lot of highways going through here. And what you can see is that we sampled children from one particular sort of region of the city, and the red dots is where a child with asthma was. The orange triangles are where controls were. Some you can't see because they're so close together. But the point being is that we had a pretty dense concentration of both asthmatics and non-asthmatics. The neighborhood was the same neighborhood where we did this study. So the first I want to show you some cross-sectional comparisons between the asthmatics and controls, and we did this through surveying them, their parents, by doing a home inspection, some monitoring for pollutants, and assaying settled dust for allergens, which I'll show you more about. And this really was fairly intensive. And what we do is we put equipment in the child's bedroom and leave it there for 3 days out of each sampling period, and we would collect a physical sample of dust particles, airborne dust, which I'll tell you more about. We'd collect the dust, we could analyze it, we vacuumed dust from 3 places in the house, including the bedroom, the kitchen, and the family or TV room that we could extract allergens from. We had a trained environmental technician examine the home, and we had developed a survey where we could ask the mom, usually the mom, occasionally the dad. For some reason, dads don't like to do surveys, moms do. And we would ask about exposures that they might have had during pregnancy, and then for yearly increments afterwards, about pets, pests, sources of heating, sources of fuel used for cooking, and so forth. So again, this is a look of what the houses look like, and this is, most of the houses we were in look a lot like this. This is, I think it's different than around here. As I flew in, I saw things are spread out. In Baltimore, we're scrunched together a little bit. So the kids that we had were quite similar in the 2 groups, asthmatics and non-asthmatics, but for the fact of asthma. They had the same average age of about 4. It was about 90% African American in both groups. Almost 90% had public health insurance, which was an indicator of poverty. And then a validity question, which is used sometimes whether you wheeze when you don't have a flu or a cold. 92% of our asthmatics said yes. Only 1% of the controls, suggesting there's not much misclassification. And one thing that's very important for our studies too is that the amount of time that people spend indoors, that's really what drove this, because we're really indoor dwelling people these days. Years ago people spent more time outdoors. Our kids are typical of Americans, which is they spend about 1 to 5 hours a day, it varies by season, outdoors, and that meaning like 20 hours or more inside a building of some sort. So the inside environment is very important. And so what did we find? We found that there were no differences by caregiver report during pregnancy, the first year of life, the second year of life, and so on and so on. No time interval did we find differences in the reports of having a dog, a cat, seeing cockroaches or mice, having gas stoves, different heating fuel types, whether there's smoking in the home. There's plenty of these things, but it didn't differ systematically from an asthma home and a non-asthma home. We looked at the amount of allergen that was in settled dust, and for dust mite, which you've probably heard about, dust mites and provoking allergy and asthma, dogs, cat, and mice, very similar between the 2. Cockroach, the same story, similar amounts of cockroach allergen in the dust. And when we looked at small particles, which I will tell you more about, I promise, PM 2.5, very small particles that get down into the alveoli, larger particles, nitrogen oxides and ozones, all very similar. So this was very interesting to us because one of the things we could conclude from this is that at least in inner city homes of preschool children, we don't find evidence that there's an asthmagenic home per se. It means two things. It means one is that just an overabundance of any of these allergens and pollutants we studied doesn't seem to cause asthma. It doesn't mean they don't have a role, though, and what it isolates is really a susceptibility factor. There's still something that makes the people who get asthma susceptible, and they are susceptible to those factors that we studied. You know, we know that asthmatics are bothered by those allergens. We know they're bothered by those pollutants, but something distinguishes an asthmatic from a non-asthmatic, and it's not simply an overabundance of one of these factors. So what's one of the factors that aggravates asthma? I want to tell you about this one because it's relatively new. People have heard about dust mites for years. Everybody that I know with asthma is told to get rid of their cat. Probably they shouldn't, right? Maybe 15% of people should, but if you're not sensitized to it, you shouldn't. Mice are something relatively new to think about. And I just want to show you, we had various ways that we assessed whether or not people had exposures to things. You know, on the left hand, what you'll see is the smoking prevalence. That's not mostly the point of this talk, but it's a remarkably high figure, by the way. About 21% of American adults smoke. Still too high, still way too high. But in the homes of preschool asthmatic children, over 50% have an adult smoker in the house. Unbelievable. It's a bad thing. It turns out to not be different whether there's an asthmatic or not. There's just tons of it. But if you look at the things people report, cats and dogs are not that common. I know around here I heard just while we were having coffee that dogs are particularly common, cats somewhat. In the inner city, cats and dogs are less common. Mice and cockroaches, not pets, but as pests, are very common. And the thing you'll see is, you know, mice, you know, it's about 65% recognize seeing mice in their house. I won't look for a show of hands who has mice in their house. I'll tell you that we do. And I live in Baltimore City, not downtown where the study is. And we borrow a neighbor's cat every once in a while, especially when the weather turns cold and the cat comes in, and within like 30 seconds there's a tail hanging out of its mouth, and I have to calm my wife down and say, you know, the mice only travel singly. That's the only mouse in the house. Don't worry, we got it. You know, you can sleep okay, and then we're okay again. But mice are very, very common. We can find mouse allergen in 100% of homes in Baltimore. And before you think you don't have it, we got to do the study here at some point, Randy, because I think that it turns out that there's mice allergen all over the country. So don't read this. I just want to tell you about what the allergen is. It's called MUS-M1, and it's a protein, and the protein is in mouse urine. Male mice have more of it than female mice. It's disgusting. I'm glad we're not at a dinner thing. You know, the mice pee on the floor. They pee on anything they're going by. And remarkably, it seems to be some kind of attractant. You know, that if you're looking for a mate, you pee on the floor, and it brings the female mice running. And so it's a horrifying thing, but it's actually a very light allergen, and they float around on particles, and we can find that most homes actually have airborne levels of these things. It's been known that people that work with mice in laboratories can develop allergies for years. There really hasn't been information until this study that mice were potentially implicated in where we live. And in this particular design, this was longitudinal, so we followed these kids over time, 0, 3, and 6 months, to see if current mouse infestation would lead somehow to future symptoms, not just concurrent symptoms, but would it predict future symptoms. And you can see, you know, when you go into a house, it's actually in some houses where there's a lot of infestation. There's no mice in this picture, but you can see these what we call mouse runs. They're areas where they run through, and there's usually a crack or a hole or some portal of entry into the house. They need food and water to survive, so if there's like pet bowls or something else, that's how they get their nourishment. But you can usually find where they're coming and going from the house. So one of the things that is very important, and for you guys in the back, I'm sorry, this is very small. This is an important point about asthma in general and about allergens, which is that you know, when I said that probably most people shouldn't get rid of their cats, I mean that the only way to know if an allergen affects you if you're an asthmatic is to get tested. And the testing you need is skin testing, where you get an itchy bump on your skin if you mount an immune response to that allergen, or you can do a blood test that tells the same thing. But if you're not sensitized to an allergen, then there's really no link to one's asthma. So in this study, what we did is we tested whether the children had a sensitization to mice or not. And the first two bars, if you look over baseline over there, the first two are kids who aren't sensitized, who have low or high mouse exposure. And those two paler bars are the same. Then there's kids who are sensitized. They have an immune response to mice. That's the third bar. And then the tall orange bar is those who are both sensitized and highly exposed. And we found at all 3 time points that if you're both sensitized and highly exposed, that you get lots of symptoms which lead to lots of albuterol or rescue medication use. And we can show the same thing is true for unscheduled doctor visits. That's it's the combination of being both sensitized and exposed highly that leads to that. And that's the typical allergen model for asthma, which is that you need both of those conditions to be true. It's not an irritant. Mice aren't a marker for something is what this means also. It's not just because you have mice that you have worse asthma. It's the mouse actually has a protein that's affecting your body. And this is a different way to represent data. This is looking at unscheduled doctor visits and ED visits, which were about 3-fold higher and 2-fold higher, respectively, in the group that had sensitization and exposure. And there's a biostatistician here somewhere, right? This is my biggest odds ratio of my career. It's almost 70, meaning the odds of having a hospitalization was about 70 to 1 if you were sensitized and exposed to mice. And the reason for that was that basically all the hospitalizations in our study occurred in that very small subset of kids who had both sensitization to mice and high exposure. So this was the first study ever actually to show that household exposure could be associated with asthma, at least in terms of making it worse. So it's given us a new target to look at for remediation. Last thing I want to talk about before I switch gears to the Hamburger story is this thing about particulate matter and NO2. Again, this is about the house and where and how we live. So particulate matter I told you I'd tell you about. And particulate matter is basically dust. It's very small dust particles. It's both natural and man-made. The natural stuff comes from the Earth's surface. So just, if you see wind blowing some dusty dirt, there's particulate matter there. Forest fires create it, pollen, spores, animal debris, just anything that's floating in the air that's very small is dust particles. And then we make it with mobile and fixed sources, meaning cars, trucks, and buses put out particulate matter, and then factories, coal-burning power plants, and things of that sort put out particulate matter. So it's in the air. It's part of what we have. And then nitrogen dioxide is a gas that comes from anything that burns. So that also comes from cars, trucks, buses, and factories and things of that sort. But also indoor, if you cook with gas, anything you cook with that is a fuel that generates fumes of any sort includes nitrogen dioxide. The reason that it might be bad is that we know it can damage the lining of the lungs. We know that if somebody has a nitrogen dioxide exposure, that they're more likely to get a viral infection if they're exposed to viruses. And it may actually contributing to getting sensitized to allergens. So I want to look at these two things in the home. So this slide, this may not look like much, but this is a very interesting slide for me. This is the particulate matter concentrations that we found in the homes versus what we found outside. And remember, this is done in Baltimore City, so I don't know what your image is of Baltimore, and it may be that you think we have air pollution, and we really do. I saw plenty coming in though today in the airport. I could see the horizon line, and there's plenty in this part of the country too. And when you see a hazy day versus a clear day, some of that haze, when it's not rain or other weather-related stuff, is actually particulate matter, and I'll show you a picture of what that looks like in a second. But on the left-hand bar, all the way over there, that heavy line is our median value, the midpoint value for what the particulate or dust concentration is in the bedrooms. The second one, the squatter one that's down there, is the outdoor air at the same time. And what you can see is we have actually much more of that particular air pollutant in our homes than we do outside of our homes in the inner city of Baltimore. And that red line that you see going across is what the EPA threshold is for regulating particulate matter. And what this tells us is about 3/4 of the houses would flunk the outdoor standard if there were such a standard for the indoors, whereas in most days we actually don't fail that standard in Baltimore. Most days we actually do okay. So this is sort of contrary to this notion that, if you're worried about pollution, you send people inside to avoid it. There may be some strategies to do that, but it's not that simple. The inside, at least in our part of the country, is not necessarily better. So just to give you a perspective on what particulate matter looks like, so that you can't really see it if you're up close. There's particulate matter in this room, but part of it, it's so small that the naked eye can't see one of those particles. The stuff we're looking at is less than the 1/10 of a width of a human hair. This is stuff that can get into the respiratory tract. So this is the Boston skyline, where the particulate matter, the fine particles, were about 10. And these units are called micrograms per meter cubed, but you don't need to remember that. But it's about 10 of these units. And so if you look back here, this is a scale that goes from 0 to 100. We actually had homes that had as much as 300 in it. Okay, so 0 to 100 is kind of our range on here, up to 300. And what you see here is about 10, so a very low rate. This is about 60. Same camera, same view, just a couple days different of the Boston skyline. So this is about a 50-point difference on that scale. Our range that I showed you is 100, but it's really about 300. So it gives you an idea. This is a 50-point difference here. In terms of the NO2 you can't see, and I can't show you a picture that shows that, but I just want to show you two things. So ambient meaning outdoors, NO2, indoor on this, and if you're a statistician, I promise you I'm not trying to tell you there's a relationship between those two things. It's a scatter plot, meaning that the NO2, the nitrogen dioxide that we're seeing in the home, isn't only just coming in from outside from the traffic. There's no relationship between the indoor and outdoor, so it's from a couple different sources, and that matters. So what do we find? Well, we find the sources of NO2 in our study were having a gas stove, having a gas heater, using a space heater, a kerosene-based space heater, or using a stove or an oven for heat. And all of these things produce NO2. So what's the impact of these things on asthma? Well, one of the things we're able to show is looking in a longitudinal model. So how does the particulate matter and NO2 that you find in the home now, what does that do to you in the future? These are symptoms people care about with asthma, having cough or wheeze or chest tightness, having to slow down what you're doing because your asthma is so bad. Limited speech, nighttime symptoms, symptoms with running, and rescue medication use. These are adjusted for outdoor particulate matter. And we can find that both fine and coarse particles, the ones that get in the lungs, actually provoke asthma, and they do it very strongly. So this is particulate matter from indoors, and we find the same thing with NO2, and this is per 20 parts per billion. That previous slide was for every 10 of those units of particulate matter. Remember, the range was 300. Every 10 of those increases it by about 5 to 10%. This is per 20 parts per billion. Our range of that is about 300, 0 to 300. So every 20 adds about 8 to 12% or so to the symptom frequency. Not trivial. I mean, this is a really important provoker of symptoms. So in terms of these three things, these are examples of what we've been working on, and I'm proud of our group, that we've been able to tackle some of these things. But now I'm going to shift to one of the things that's made me frustrated about this work, and why I don't think that we're as close as I want to be to the truth. So remember this boy. So he's 10 years old. He's symptomatic. He lives where he lives in East Baltimore. He's on lots of medications. He's got some exposures that matter: smoke, mice, and cockroaches. And I think, there's a lot of different things you can put in the center here. A lot of our work is focused on race. Why is there a difference by race? Why does that exist? And I think it's in part not one thing, but there are things that collect in a disadvantageous way, that not one of them is the problem, but together they combine. Each one of these things I'm going to show you has been shown to independently of race to track with more asthma and worse asthma. So we know that people who have less income have more asthma and they get worse asthma. That also associates with race. Less education, certain occupations. Healthcare access is an issue, exposure to allergens, exposure to ambient or outdoor air pollution, indoor pollution, and then one other thing that I want to talk about, which I think might be true, which is food. And I think there are other things you could add here. This is not a complete list, but to give an idea that we can't think about asthma as something that's just caused by one thing, provoked by one thing, but I think it's the milieu or the soup that people live in. I think food's part of it, and I'll show you why. So this same boy, we asked his mom to help us figure out what he ate. And we were doing this systematically with a 24-hour recall and asking all the kids in our study. A couple of years ago, we were asking, what did you eat? And what I've shown on this slide is foods that he commonly ate. So anything he ate at least twice during the week prior to when we met him. And I bet there's people in this room that this sounds pretty good to. So I don't want to, I'm not trying to be disparaging here, but sugary cereal and milk, cheese sandwich, hot dog, pancakes, butter, syrup, sausage, bacon, pizza, French fries, ketchup. They were getting into the vegetables: ketchup, greens, and string beans. The fruit is fruit cocktail and applesauce, and then rounded out with cream pie, cookies, potato chips, Kool-Aid, and water. And this is a pretty typical diet for kids in our neighborhood. It's what my kids would eat if I didn't have to pry this stuff out of their hands every day that I can. I mean, I had to negotiate real maple syrup instead of that big vat of corn syrup that was on the table for a while. I mean, kids will eat this stuff if they can. But I started to wonder, how could this not have something to do with health? There's lots of us who are worried about our diet, and how could it not have something to do with this particular kid? So it gets us back to this issue too, which is, can we think about diet, and is there some reason to wonder about it, and can we use it to help explain this disparity that not only is big between black and whites to begin with, but is even bigger now than it was 30 years ago. And when we look here, I want to go back to this year here also. So here's 1998. Okay, this was when our boy was born that I showed you. If you look here, a lot of people talk about the asthma epidemic starting in 1980. The reason people say that is because it's when the CDC started to administer this questionnaire. So they didn't administer this questionnaire in 1979 or 1978. So we assume it started in 1980. But if you do, there are some government data, and if you look back here, this is sort of a messy slide, but what this shows is 4 different regions, and the different regions form each of those different curves. Don't worry worry about the different regions. I think it's more similar than not. This starts actually back in 1960 at the far end and goes up to 1992. And one of the things you can see is this is mortality rate from asthma. Between 1960 and about the mid-1970s, actually asthma was getting better. You know, it was actually going down when we look at mortality as an indicator of how asthma health is going. And it really didn't start going up until a little before 1980. Those questionnaires started being administered in 1980. But I sort of see the change around, you know, the early to mid-1970s. And so I don't know why it was going down. I don't know if anybody knows why it was going down. But we're trying to focus on why it's going up now and what might have happened. So what's the problem? I'm excited about our mice findings. I mean, I think that's pretty interesting stuff. It's very important that we found an allergen that provokes asthma. I don't think it's what's happened to cause that epidemic curve. I mean, the reason I don't think that is because mice aren't new. You know, we didn't just invent them a couple of years ago, and it's not new for people to live around them, as far as I know, that they've been on farms for years in other places. So I don't think mice are the reason per se, because we've had them for a while. Cockroaches are as old as dinosaurs, you know, and they're exciting to think about. They're awful and they're icky, and if we get rid of them, asthma might get better. But I don't see any way in the world to make a case that all of a sudden in the mid-1970s we had cockroaches. It just doesn't make any sense. So this is kind of what's frustrating about it. Some of these factors that we're so proud of, I don't think can explain why people are susceptible. We could look at cigarette smoking. I showed you that it's a problem in our city, but if we're trying to understand disparities between black and white, this starts at 1965 and comes up to just about the present. The lower line is all adults. Black males are in the purple, and what you can see is there was a disparity. It's just about gone away. This curve isn't as low as I'd like it. I'd like it to be 0, but the point being that we really don't see, we actually see a narrowing of the smoking rates between races, so that doesn't make sense that that would be the reason for there to be a disparity or a sudden taking off in asthma in this time period. Well, what about where we live? You know, we know that people don't live randomly. They don't get assigned randomly to houses, and where people live has something to do with culture and, you know, who they want as neighbors and things of that sort. And so if we look at, these are people living in counties that fail at least one EPA outdoor air quality standard. One thing we can see is no matter what group you belong to, you're more likely than not to live in a county that fails EPA air quality standards. But Hispanics actually seem to have the most of that problem, African Americans next, and then whites. So maybe outdoor air pollution is the explanation. This kind of stuff. I mean, this fortunately is an older picture, and we don't see so much of this kind of stuff, but it'd be totally logical to me that we could see a rise in a respiratory epidemic if outdoor air pollution were different. But this is a very typical slide for pollutants, and it's largely an artifact of the good benefits of the Clean Air Act, which is that we see that this is particulate matter, and I made that mark in the mid-1970s. It was already going down. We can debate at a different time whether it's gone down far enough, but it's not going up. Particulate matter is coming down, and most of the pollutants that we care about that I've shown you, there's a similar curve like this for that same time period. So at least from an ecological standpoint, the things that we tend to think about with asthma don't seem to be going the way you would expect them to if that was a sudden reason for there to be a change in the epidemic curve. So what else is going on? So this is pretty interesting. So this is curves of overweight, obesity, and extremely obese. And if we look right here, you know, the curve was trending up a little bit. So it looks like it was about, you know, 10 to 15% of people are obese, but all of a sudden, at least where it's marked 1976 to 1980, all of a sudden the curve bends and takes off and never looks back. I mean, it's still going up. You know, it's really easy, I guess, if you're an obesity researcher to keep getting published because, you know, until we hit 100, it just seems to keep going up. You know, it's just going crazy. But the time period to me is very interesting, that inflection point. It's the same time period that I look at with the asthma mortality curve. This is a picture. I was at the Maryland State Fair last summer, and I couldn't resist this thing. It's called deep fried Buckeyes. But the amazing thing is, and I'm sorry if I'm offending somebody's taste here, but I saw this deep fried Oreos, deep fried Snickers, deep fried Milky Way, deep fried Three Musketeers, and you can wash it down with Pepsi or Dr. Pepper, you know, right in front of that. And I thought, my God, you know. And my son, who's actually walking away in the picture, he's the kid far to the left, not the one who's facing us. You know, he begged me for one of these. I'm like, no, like this is horrible. So it's not a surprise to me that, you know, that some of this stuff is going on. So you may have seen some of these things or not, but the CDC has done a great job of tracking obesity trends. And so if we're interested in disparities, you know, it's non-Hispanic whites in the upper left, blacks in the upper right, and Hispanics down here. And the way that this works is this is the percentage of people whose body mass index is greater than or equal to 30, which defines obesity. And the darker the color, the greater the percentage of people that meet that obesity criterion. So dark, bad, light, good for this one. And what you can see is that blacks have a lot more obesity in each state for the most part than do whites. Hispanics kind of in between. You can see Tennessee jumping out there. I see that catches my eye, at least for Hispanics, you know. But so this makes sense that if we're looking at something to do with obesity and something to do with asthma, that there might be some kind of link if it's going to explain a race-based disparity. And just to give you a visual on this, this normal weight is the person all the way to the left, overweight's the second one, obese it's all those people that are the third, fourth, and fifth person that we're talking about. That's sort of like what the silhouette looks like if somebody's obese, severely obese, and morbidly obese. So we're talking about people that are overweight for sure. Who's read this? Anybody read this? A couple people? I read this book. It actually changed the way I think about this. I had been thinking about diet for a while, but it actually led to the grant that I'll tell you about because I was so impressed with this book. I won't tell you a lot about it, but anybody know this guy? Guido Sarducci, Saturday Night Live, right? And one of my favorite things about him is he had that, was it 1 minute or 2 minute university? And he tells you that, you come to his college and you'll learn, you're going to forget everything anyway. So that, like Spanish class is como está usted, muy bien, that's it. That's all you're going to remember in a couple of years anyways. And, he's like, the economics class is buy low, sell high. That's all you're going to remember. So that's his whole notion. And the book is so rich that I would actually want to talk about it a lot. But these are the two things I got from it that I think I'll remember years from now, which is we eat a lot of corn. And it's unbelievable how much we eat. And the other is that he makes a case that industrialized food really took off in the 1970s, I saw a lot of this. I'm no cow expert. I guess these are dairy cows of some sort. I saw cows like this, though, coming in on the airplane today, which made me happy. I mean, seeing cows walking in grass, not that particular breed or strain of cows. But these are, this is the way farming used to be, and it looks like that's the way it is in the Tri-Cities area, currently. But this is part of what's happened also, and this is becoming more familiar in certain states where there's an industrialization to the food processing that goes on. These cows are leaning over, eating some sort of grain, which is either corn or soy or some mixture of the two, and this has become quite typical in certain parts of the country. So that's why, in part, I'm trying to understand this race difference. I think there's some reasons to make me think about food, and I'll show you a little bit more. So how can I get closer here? Well, it turns out that there's good data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture on how much food's available, and it turns out we eat what's available. So the one's a pretty good indicator of the other, meaning that the amount we're producing is the amount that we eat. And this scale starts at 1979. I couldn't get it to go back further. It goes up to 2005. This is fruit and vegetables, fruit in red, vegetables in blue. And I think you'll agree that there's really not much of a trend. There may be a slight upward trend, but we're not seeing anything going like this, right? I mean, fruit and vegetables pretty steady, over these last few decades. If we look at corn products, that's the purple line. There does seem to be a bend in the curve there, and it's right about 1973. And it happened as a direct consequence of what I think is an ironically named act, which is the Agriculture and Consumer Protection Act of 1973, because it really led to a big fundamental change in what we produce and what we eat. And there were big incentives now to grow and produce corn. Not necessarily a bad thing. Having less expensive food is good, but it certainly changed what we're doing. So we went from 10 pounds per capita per year of corn products to nearly 35 pounds. Really changed what we eat in a very, very short time period from 1973. Up to the present time. Well, how about things like corn sweeteners? So here's corn sweeteners that same time period, and it looks like that was trending up, but all of a sudden took off and kept going, and became the sweetener of choice. It looks like from that time period. And if we look at some other things too, I thought it's just interesting that where those lines crisscross just happens to be the same year that's caught my attention, which is the mid-70s. It's when beverage milk lost ground to carbonated soft drinks as the drink of choice. We were sort of changing our habits all of a sudden, it looks like, from the 70s onwards. I don't see that that's where the beef rise starts. It looks like it was already going up, but I think what the beef eat probably changed in that time period. But there were some trends that were already occurring, I think, in terms of meat consumption. So, sorry, I threw a little bit of science in here. For those of you who don't like science, just go back to sleep and I'll just tell you what this says. But this is actually a pretty important slide in some ways. Leukotrienes are part of the inflammation system. And if anybody's heard of Montelukast or Singulair that kids and adults take for asthma and allergies, what they do is they block a certain kind of leukotriene, which is that one called LTC3 and LTC4 and LTE4. And those are important leukotrienes because what they do is they make the smooth muscle of the airways constrict, they make mucus come out, they make asthma worse when it happens. Well, it turns out that these things are produced from the food that we eat, and the food is the input for enzymes that convert one thing to another. And if you look here, so this is leukotriene C4 and E4, and it comes from arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is fed in part by linoleic acid. Well, linoleic acid comes from corn. So it's a 6-carbon fatty acid that feeds this pathway, among other things. And there's at least one study that I think is very interesting done in Japan where some clever investigators took asthmatics and they fed asthmatics corn oil, so 6-carbon fatty acids, versus some 3-carbon fatty acids. And the 3 carbons are also called omega-3s, like you hear about in fish and things of that sort. In this case, they used perilla seed oil. And what this figure shows is the change in the leukotriene, LTC4, the bad leukotriene for our purposes, didn't change at all when they got the perilla seed oil, but it went up. That's the dotted line. It went up when they got the corn oil. Lung function got better, 27% better in the group that got the 3-carbon fatty acid, and it stayed about the same in the group that got the corn. So this is interesting. It's a small study, but it actually does suggest that there might even be something specific about a product of corn that can actually drive a pathway that we already recognize has to do with allergies and asthma. Alpha-linolenic acid, sounds like linoleic acid, but it's not. Alpha-linolenic acid actually drives production of a favorable leukotriene, and that comes from seeds, green leaves, and animals that eat greens as opposed to animals that eat corn. It drives this other pathway. So there's some interesting, interconnections, I think, between, certain foods and so forth. I also think, though, that it's not as simple. I think that, just like it's not mice, it's not cockroach, it's not one thing, I think dietary pattern probably has more to do than any one single food. And everything that we eat, we sort of replace with something else. And there's been a lot of interest in the so-called Mediterranean diet as well. And I think the pattern's important. This is a diet that's just gotten this nickname because it looks like what people used to eat that worked around the Mediterranean Sea back in the 50s and 60s. And it's heavy on fruits and vegetables, lots of whole grains, legumes, nuts, olive oil is the source of fat. Rich in antioxidants, and there's all kinds of observational studies that have shown that people who eat a diet that's skewed in this way have better lipids, better blood pressure, less body mass index, and that there's markers of systemic inflammation, coagulation's better, and so forth. Lots of health good things that go along with eating that diet. This is what it looks like sort of pictorially, and you can see that there's not no red meat or sweets. They're there, but they're in small amounts compared with the relative abundance of things like breads, rice, vegetables, fruits, and so forth. So it's a diet that some people would recognize as a healthy diet, not sort of the 7-Eleven or McDonald's diet. So there's a few studies that actually look at this, and I won't tell you too much about them other than to say that there's some really good information out there that when people grade what the diet is, and they ask people what did you eat, and then you count up the kinds of foods, you can score it, and you can say it's more or less like this ideal Mediterranean diet. There's one study in a couple of thousand kids that showed that kids that eat a more Mediterranean-like diet are less likely to have asthma and allergies. There's a study that shows the lower incidence of allergic rhinitis in kids that have that diet. Asthmatics who already have asthma have better control of their asthma that have that diet, and there's markers that you can look for of oxidative stress and antioxidants, lower markers of inflammation in people who have that diet. This is a fascinating study. This is 55,000 women studied in France, and the investigators did something called principal components analysis. It turns out that that what you eat, if you eat hot dogs, you tend to eat hamburgers. People who eat fruits eat vegetables and so forth. And statistically, you can find ways to lump together what people tend to eat versus not eat. And they found 3 distinct dietary groupings that they nicknamed the prudent diet, the Western diet, and the nuts and wine diet. And the prudent diet was heavy on fruits and vegetables. The Western was heavy on pizza, salty pies, desserts, and cured meats. And the nuts and wine had, besides wine, seeds and biscuits and olives. And the thing that they found is that the women with the Western diet had the highest asthma attack rate. The women with the lowest risk were those that were having nuts and wine as their predominant dietary type. The fruit and veg was kind of in between. They're very interesting. So these patterns of what people eat associated with how they're faring in terms of their asthma. So maybe there is something going on here. Maybe there's something going on with the dietary pattern. So how do we bring this back to Baltimore and the healthcare disparities? How do I get there? Okay, so there's a couple of things that we know. Dietary patterns in urban African Americans are different than they are in non-African Americans. Well below recommended fruit and vegetable levels, very high in meat consumption, low in nut and legumes. And when you compare blacks to whites, that the diet is skewed away from certain ideals of what a healthy diet is. So nationwide data support that there might be a difference by race. In Baltimore City, very interesting that You know, a lot of people spend time at Hopkins. There's a guy named Manuel Franco who's from Madrid who was doing his doctoral work at Hopkins, and he took on this study to look at the availability of healthy food. You know, so does it also make sense? I mean, you can only eat what's in front of you, right? And so people don't tend to drive 20 miles to get food. You have to, you know, sort of, you know, get it closer to home. And a big circle here. This is the same map of Baltimore, by the way, that I showed you before. This upper right corner. The inner harbors down there at the bottom. And the little dots are stores that sell what were graded as low quality food, like fast food and junk food and things of that sort. Big circles are things like Whole Foods and other good stores. And what's the place here that we, yeah, it's places like that good store, you know, that you guys have in town. So the big circles are like that, the little circles are not. And in this city, where the light areas are where blacks tend to live, the darker areas are where whites tend to live, and what you can see is there's sort of a race difference between the availability of healthy foods or not. I can tell you, too, that star, that's where I work, that's Johns Hopkins Hospital. It's like ground zero for the little dots, you know, and I can attest to it. If you come to our cafeteria, you'd be horrified. It's really bad food there. But there is something to this, which is that the food isn't just sort of randomly placed. It's systematically different in certain neighborhoods. So that makes sense. And then my good luck is every time I think I've got an idea that I'm going to do something new, I find out somebody else is already doing it. This was true in Baltimore. A woman who doesn't even live in Baltimore, Sangeeta Sharma, came to Baltimore from, at that time, University of Hawaii to study Baltimore diet. My good fortune, but it's like, so she's already doing it. She went to UNC next, now she's up in Ottawa, and she studies diet all over the world and got interested in Baltimore diet. So lucky me, she'd already done this. She did 24-hour recalls on 91 low-income African Americans who were adults. And what she found is that the fruit servings per day was a little under 2, where the USDA recommends 2 to 4. Veg was 0.7, recommended 3 to 5. Meat was 8. 8 servings of meat per day on average, recommends 2 to 3. And because averages don't tell you everything, 2/3 had no fruit, 3/4 had no vegetables, and the 2 major caloric contributions were soda and chicken. Unbelievable. So this is the diet that we have in our neighborhood, soda and chicken. So we applied to try to see if we could study this further, and I created a study named, it's a bunch of words, I just wanted it to add up to asthma diet, so don't worry about what the words are. It's a study to do something or other. But it's funded by NIH and EPA for 5 years for us to link with our Children's Center, and I'll just show you this. Just mention, just as an aside, my name's never been particularly useful to me professionally. You know, I've always wanted to be one of these guys like Dr. Kidney, you know, he's a nephrologist or something, you know. And it's never been helpful except like with phone solicitors. You know, they call up and they say, is Mr. Diette there? And I say Diette, so I know to hang up, you know, right away. Otherwise, it's not helpful. But if this stuff takes off, I'm going to try to exploit it. I might change the way I say my name. That's the way I'm going here. So anyway, so what's the model for this? I think the model for this is that we do know that allergens provoke inflammation. We do know pollutants provoke oxidative stress, that there's relationships between inflammation and oxidative stress. But I think what we're onto here is that diet modifies that. I think diet can provoke inflammation. I think diet can lack the capacity to protect us against things that could harm us. And that diet as a modifying factor is really what we're studying. And what we're planning to do here is a combination of things. An observational study where we're going to observe what the diet is in asthmatics and relate it to their health. We're doing clinical trials that I'll tell you about where we're going to change the diet and dietary components in deliberate ways. And we have mouse models, too, that can teach us about the response to allergens and pollutants. And I'll tell you about that, too, to finish. So just a couple more things here about this. So this study is ongoing right now. We're recruiting a total of 200 kids with asthma that are school-aged kids, and we're doing air monitoring like we did in some of our other studies, but for a longer period of time where we'll measure what the pollutants are. We're going to measure what the allergens are they're exposed to. We measure their lung function twice a day, every day during the study. We collect biological samples, so exhaled nitrogen oxide, which is a marker of inflammation. We collect urine, blood. We rinse the nose with saline to get cells and fluid and so forth. And we can look at the relationship between what they've eaten and what their response is in the real world. So this isn't a trial, this is what their real world response is to the things that they're encountering as a function of what their diet is. This is a study in Barbados we're doing. I just like the picture because we have our kids in a variety of studies wear a backpack. So one of the ways we track what the pollutant exposure is there's a pollutant monitor in that backpack, and that's one of our happy participants in another study. But we do this in Baltimore, we do it other places where we'll be able to track actually minute-to-minute variation what their pollution is, and we can link that to what's happening in terms of inflammation and oxidative stress. One more science slide, I'm sorry, but this actually is kind of neat. And there's nothing that you have to memorize. It's not on the test, all right, so don't worry. But NRF2 is the thing of interest here. So NRF2 is in that bubble up at the top. NRF2 is a transcription factor, and what a transcription factor is, it's something in our body and it turns on genes. So when NRF2 gets activated, it turns on genes, and those genes do good things. They're part of our whole antioxidant response system. So a whole variety of stressors that come into the body, and that oval circle NRF2 there is outside of the cell's nucleus. It encounters all kinds of things, whether it's electrophiles or viruses or other things, and it stimulates NRF2 to go into the nucleus and turn on all these genes, and all these genes constitute our antioxidant response system. It's a great system, and it gets turned on abruptly and thoroughly by turning on NRF2. So why does that matter? Well, it turns out that NRF2 is stimulated by foods, and there's a food that has a natural stimulator of NRF2, this transcription factor that turns on antioxidants. And one of the things that I think is interesting about foods is every pharmaceutical company rightly wants to find what's the substance that matters. But in this case, there is an extract of this sulforaphane, but in the plants, and it's cruciferous plants, meaning broccoli and cauliflower, it actually exists in different cells. There's a precursor to sulforaphane and an enzyme in other cells, and as you chew, it actually pushes these two things together and creates all of a sudden the active enzyme. Well, it's not only present in broccoli and cauliflower, but in broccoli sprouts, the little fluffy things as they emerge from the soil have tons of it in it, and it's the most potent activator of NRF2 that's naturally occurring. So we can take advantage of this, and one of the things we're doing is we have an ongoing clinical trial where we have a feeding study, and we're taking asthmatics who are sensitized to mouse. We're going back to mouse. So they are sensitized to mouse, and they have a lung function drop when they encounter mice, and we're feeding them broccoli sprout extract in the form of sandwich wraps, and we have a placebo control, which is alfalfa sprouts, which don't have sulforaphane in it. And we can compare within the same person and between people how they respond to allergens. And the way we do this is we have a mouse room, and this is a room just where we keep mice, and the mice are there only to be allergen producers. And when people go into this room that have a response to mice, they have a predictable response, and we can see if we can modify what their asthmatic response is by adding this, this food stimulator of the antioxidant system. And we think it's got a lot of promise. At least we'll be able to look at, we have a whole suite of biological indicators of this, not just whether lung function and symptoms occur, but we can look at certain pathways and see if we are in fact stimulating the pathways that we want to. Another study that we're doing, and we're going to transform the diet. So it's another lucky thing for me working at a place like Hopkins. There are people who have created these diets which actually reduce blood pressure. It's really remarkable to me, even now to think about it. But there's this diet called the DASH diet, and if you haven't heard about it, you might look it up online. It's really a very good healthy diet. If somebody has blood pressure problems, this diet alone, an isocaloric diet, meaning that you don't gain weight or lose weight. If you change your diet to a diet that looks like that, the blood pressure comes down several points, without medications. It's not a low-salt diet. It's the dietary composition. There's a high unsaturated fat version of this diet, because when they did this diet, they took out saturated fats. Saturated fats are bad fats, right? But they didn't know whether to put in protein or carbohydrates or unsaturated fats. So there's a Mediterranean-style version of this that we can take advantage of. We're going to take people who are eating the inner-city diet and change their diet to this highly regulated Mediterranean-style diet and see if we can transform their asthma. And in these people, we're going to expose them to allergens and also to pollutants. And I'll show you the last slide that I'll show you. It shows a picture of a pollutant collector we have, but we can expose people to the pollutants that we find in homes. Another little sciencey slide, but you'll get something from here. I just want to show you something about the mouse work that we have capable. A colleague of mine, Shyam Biswal, does this. And the only thing to know here is that he has a mouse that's a genetic defect on the lower part. They don't have NRF2, so that transcription factor they can't make. And when you compare mice that do have it to those that don't, if you look at this panel right here, I'll just show you this one and this one. These are mice that get ragweed. Okay, so ragweed's an allergen. And what you can see even from the back of the room is there's a lot more red dots in the airway of the lower part, and there's a bigger inflammatory response when mice lack NRF2. Same thing happens in humans if we have less NRF2, we think. We can see cytokines, which are communication signals that are higher, sort of worse, if you will, in the mice that lack NRF2, and also airways hyperresponsiveness, which means the tendency of the airways to constrict when they're exposed to to something much greater in the mice that don't have NRF2. So we can take advantage of this, and we can feed the mice that either do or don't have NRF2, the same system that we're thinking about in humans, and we can feed them sulforaphane from broccoli sprouts. And we can expose them to allergens and pollutants and see if there's a difference when we manipulate the diet. We can also create a Mediterranean-style diet, and it's not like bronzini and olive oil and stuff, but we can manipulate the fatty acid ratio and also test the mice. The exposures we have are not only allergens, but actual particulate matter that we can collect from Baltimore homes, and we have apparatuses like this, which is, a friend of mine has an HVAC company, and he helped me rig this up. This is a vacuum cleaner that you put in the wall of a house. You know, it's going to have a central vacuum unit, but it sucks a ton of air, which is what we need, and we run this up the stairs from the basement with a cyclone to collect the particles. But the neat thing is we can collect them and we can use them then in our experiments. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of kind of some of the stuff that we're trying to do here. The last thing I'll just finish with is, you know, I like talking about this stuff as if I did it all, and I really didn't. I just organized some of it, and I do some of it. But I've got a huge cast of people that I work with that are investigators. We have funding agencies. We've got a ton of connections. There's people I've left off of this for sure, but it's a big operation. And I think I'll stop there and thank you guys for your attention, and happy to answer any questions if you have.
Where are you placing heredity in this epidemic?
It's a great question. I mean, so the question, if you didn't hear it, is the role of heredity in the asthma epidemic. I don't think it's got much to do with it at all, and there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that if you look at those epidemic curves, they're occurring over a couple of decades, and our genes don't change that fast. So where there's genetic shifts over time, generational shifts, it really doesn't occur within a single generation, and that's what we're seeing here. It has to be something that's extrinsic, not something that's built in. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't genes that predispose somebody to having a bad response to things that have changed. So it could be that some people have the gene that makes them more susceptible to mice, for example, and so that still might be a factor, but I don't think it's the predominant factor by any means. There's also an enormous amount of energy and money and time that's gone into genetic studies in asthma, and they've produced very, very little useful in my view. What they've done is they've shown that we mostly don't have any dominant genes that predict asthma, and that if anything, there's going to be a combination of genes that each one of which has some minor contribution to it. So I don't think mostly genetics.
Greg, that's really some amazing stuff, and you focus a lot on childhood asthma and some direct environmental and dietary contributions. But it seems to me there's also, and I think maybe Mickey was getting at genetics, and there's differences in sex. Women seem to be more prone than men, gender rather. Aren't there like 5 phenotypes of asthma, and older women tend to be one subgroup which has a high prevalence of asthma? What's the story there? Is that something that we should be cognizant of when we look at the big picture, which is the healthcare costs associated with some of these chronic diseases?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so there are different things that track with age, sex, and race. And you know, if you were to draw a pie, for example, of all the people who die from asthma in a given year in the United States, the biggest part of that pie would be older women. And it would be especially older white women, because there are more white women than there are black women. So that just by a predominance of who lives in our population, you'd find the biggest number being older white women. Women are more likely to die of asthma than are men. Women are more likely to have asthma than are men. No idea why, but it's a fact epidemiologically. If you look at mortality, you know, we focus on kids for a couple of reasons, but not because of mortality. Over half the mortality is in adults who are 65 years and older. So even though the notion is that it's a pediatric disease, that's not where the mortality is for the most part. Yeah.
You say we don't know why, but there are. When you
might know why.
When you look at diet and endocrine and stress and things like that, I think there are differences. And if we do have a group that is very highly part of the mortality equation, I think maybe there are some indicators that there is part of the pathology there that we should be looking at.
Oh, yeah.
And obesity, for example, metabolic syndrome, the contribution of physical inactivity, and some of those dietary factors, stress. I think women are the canaries in the coal mine, as far as I can tell you.
You could draw one of the same figures that I did and put women versus men in the middle of it and have things that circle around it. I think it's a similar story, which is there's many factors. It's not what I'm focused on right now, but it's clearly important, and it's it's.
It's really fascinating stuff and very rich, and of course we're in a part of the country where we don't have a lot of African American population, and I'm a health director in a few counties where our population is about 97% Caucasian, but we have very high rates of asthma in children, and in particular in some of our coal-producing counties, and of course a lot of people think that, well, because of both of the burning of coal and the particulate matter that's produced in the mining of coal, that has an impact. They think cigarette smoke is important too, but not so much. Our rates of smoking, by the way, are about 27% of the population in those counties, so that's certainly a factor. And we also have a lot of obesity. And I would say that you would probably find, and I would invite you to Southwest Virginia to do some research if you'd like, but I would say you'd probably find similar disparities in our Caucasian population that you find in the inner city African American population of Baltimore. So having said all that, I'm interested in your opinion about that, and I'm also interested in kind of a related question, the obesity factor with respect to the clinical worsening of asthma, and then the dietary issue. And do you think those are independent, or do you think they're completely linked?
Great question. So I mean, in terms of the race issue, I don't think that race per se is the risk factor for asthma or for worsened asthma. I think that there are factors that aggregate by all kinds of different demographic features. And African Americans, particularly in inner cities in this country, those unfavorable factors aggregate. When you do a study and you account for all those, though, there's still something that isn't explained. So I don't think we can say with absolute confidence. But I agree with you. If you have markers of things that have been shown to be associated with more asthma and worse asthma, if it's poverty, if it's bad diet, if it's other things, it's not exclusive to one race or another in any case. In terms of the invitation to come here and study it, I would love to. I mean, Tricia, Metz and I, and Randy and I have been talking for a couple of years, and others in here about trying to get some studies going. I think it's long overdue, and I think some of the best evidence that we have for what to do about asthma comes, fortunately, from some well-conducted trials, but in populations that are quite different. And so I think we need to, encourage the resources to be directed towards rural populations and understand that too. The issue of obesity and asthma, there's a lot of attention to that about whether or not it's whether or not one causes the other. I'm actually less impressed with the data that one causes the other than I am that there's an underlying risk factor for both. And the reason I think that is because of those curves that I showed you is both epidemics took off at the same time. It's possible that people became obese and all of a sudden asthma came out, but that doesn't make as much sense to me as something fundamentally. I mean, I don't want to overplay that book, but if you guys have time to read Omnivore's Dilemma or something like it, it's a transformative book for me. And I think one of the messages I took from it was that how and what we eat and how our food is produced changed at a seismic level, not just small incremental changes over time. It's really remarkable how different it is what we consume now compared with what we did. I think inactivity's obviously got something to do with obesity also, but I don't think we just all of a sudden stopped moving. I mean, I think we do less, but I don't think that all of a sudden stopped at that same moment. And so I think they're parallel epidemics. They probably impact on each other just like diabetes and obesity impact on each other, but I don't think they necessarily, don't, that doesn't mean that they don't derive from the same underlying, root cause.
I agree with a lot of things you're saying, but when you compare diet and the incidence of GI reflux, I mean, I see a lot of patients that are quote-unquote labeled as bronchial asthma. I see a lot of obesity and sleep apnea syndrome in my practice. and some of them have a significant GI reflux. So before we blame the diet itself just contributing to bronchial asthma, the other factors, GI reflex is just one example. And of course, as you just mentioned, we are using more synthetic food and chemicals in the food, not the hamburger itself, but what is in it. The third issue is diagnosis. I'm sure you have seen this, and I have seen this. A general practitioner would send me a patient with diagnosis of bronchial asthma, and when I give macrolide challenge test, they are frequently negative. They are COPD with a acute viral syndrome that act like bronchial asthma for a short time. I had several cases of bronchial polyps on bronchoscopy that were carried on bronchial asthma for a long time. So some of this data that the bronchial asthma in geriatric group, maybe the physicians are not making accurate diagnosis. They are more sensitive about the diagnosis. So I'm concerned. In fact, if you look at 2009 and 2010 data, there is actually some decline of bronchial asthma. So this whole epidemic needs to be looked at in the full spectrum. What do you think about that?
Well, there's a lot of issues you brought up. I mean, the reflux issue is an important one, and there's no question that symptomatic gastroesophageal reflux disease can worsen asthma symptoms. There's now really good evidence that silent gastroesophageal reflux disease doesn't. So to the extent that somebody has an indication for treatment, which is symptomatic reflux, that's a good thing to treat for its own sake, but it also probably would help asthma. But there's not a push to actually anymore use medications or even non-medication approaches to treat reflux if it's just measurable with, say, a pH probe. The issue about misclassification of asthma, I think, is different in a referral practice than it is in the general population. And I think the same thing you do, which is my practice. An awful lot of my referrals are people that have either difficulties in management or there's some question about the diagnosis. And that's really the role of a specialty practice. And I think by the very nature, a lot of people are referred appropriately because there's a confusion, and a lot turn out to have something else. They have a different diagnosis entirely. And that makes sense. In terms of the population data, there's been a lot of attention to that, and I think that's been pretty much put aside, that this is all just greater recognition. And there are some studies that corroborate that. Some of them, for example, where if it were all just greater recognition, there are studies that have looked at like skin testing results, for example. And so atopic disease measured objectively, not because a clinician thought about it, but studying populations, has gone up at the same time period. So you can find an IgE response to it. There's some question, too, where folks have looked at things like diagnostic transfer, that maybe the asthma label became more popular than bronchitis, but when it's looked at that way, there's actually been a rise in sort of what should be competing diagnoses. They've risen at the same time, so there isn't just a substitution of one diagnosis for the other. That said, asthma is an imperfect diagnosis. It's a syndrome. There's not a single test you can do for it, so I think we should be skeptical. But I don't think that there's good evidence that that's what's really driving these numbers.
One last question.
Oh, thank you. It's a wonderful presentation. I have a question. Did you check the interaction between smoking and the other exposure, like mouth exposure or PM10 or PM2.5, something, or the other exposures, something, interaction,
Yeah, you've asked a good question. I mean, the question there is about whether or not we looked at the interaction between allergens and pollutants, and specifically between mouse allergen and pollutants. And I showed you earlier on, there was that stream of all the funding that we'd had from 1998. We have a center called the Discover Center, which is oriented to just that question. Our whole question is about the interactions between pollutants and allergens, and whether or not they provoke inflammation and oxidative stress differently when they're operating together versus not. So we actually, in that population, we're oversampling people who have a mouse sensitization and looking at what their particulate matter response is, both in the real world, observationally, and in experimental studies, to see, do we induce a change? So I don't have the answer yet, but we're active on that too, to look at the interactions between those two components. It's a great question.
Well, Greg, may thank you again for a great lecture. Wait, before you go. We have our traditional parting gifts.
Oh,
this is the South, after all. We're not heartless and cold like Baltimore.
I hope there's barbecue in here.
No, we, first of all, we want to extend to you the title of honorary professor in the College of Public Health. We believe you'll be the first person at Hopkins to have this, and we know that this will take the place of all the other diplomas on your wall.
Oh, it sure will. Oh, I'll glue it right on top of the other ones.
And then we also have for you an Encyclopedia of Appalachia,
Oh, wow.
which we know you'll want to read and make you want to reconsider the urban lifestyle.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me here, and thanks to everybody for coming out tonight.
Thank you. Let me close by thanking you all for being here, and not just tonight, but the whole lecture series. Our goal, as you figured out, is to bring in a whole variety of perspectives on issues. If there's any topics or speakers that you all are interested in seeing next year, let me know. We'll do our best to get them, though I doubt we'll be able to top some of the folks we had this year. So thank you all for being here, and look forward to seeing you next year. Thanks.
Can I have your business card?
Oh, sure. Yeah.